A humble black woman fled her wedding, then accidentally ended up in a handsome millionaire's car, and his life. Janelle Carter thought she had her life under control until her son mistook her ruthless billionaire boss for his father. One slip of a word, and now Graham Kensington is looking at her differently and asking questions she's not ready to answer. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The alarm buzzed loudly, and Janelle Carter's hand shot out from under the covers to silence it. 5:30 in the morning again. She allowed herself just 10 seconds to close her eyes before forcing herself to sit up. The small apartment was quiet except for the soft sound of her son Micah's breathing from the room next door. Every morning was the same routine: shower, dress, prepare breakfast, pack lunch, and wake Micah. As she stood in front of her closet, Janelle chose her usual work attire, a simple black skirt, white blouse, and the only pair of decent heels she owned. She couldn't afford to look anything less than professional as the executive assistant to Graham Kensington, one of the most demanding bosses in New York City. "Micah, honey, time to wake up," she called, gently shaking her 5-year-old son. His curly hair was wild against the pillow, and he blinked up at her with those big brown eyes that melted her heart every time. "5 more minutes, Mummy," he mumbled, pulling the covers over his head. Janelle smiled despite her exhaustion. "Not today, sweetie. Mrs. Jenkins is expecting you early, remember?" Mrs. Jenkins was their elderly neighbor who watched Micah before school and after. Without her, Janelle didn't know how she'd manage to keep her job. The pay was good, better than anything else she could hope for with her qualifications. But the hours were long, and Graham Kensington expected nothing less than perfection. By 7 o'clock, they were out the door. Janelle dropped Micah off at Mrs. Jenkins' apartment, kissing him goodbye. "Be good today, okay? I'll pick you up after work." "I love you, Mommy," Micah said, hugging her tightly around the waist. "I love you more," she replied. Their usual morning exchange. The subway was crowded as always, and Janelle held onto the handrail, mentally going through the day's schedule. Mr. Kensington had 3 important meetings, and she needed to prepare all the presentations and briefing notes. Her phone buzzed in her purse. A text message from Mrs. Jenkins made her heart sink. "Sorry, Janelle. I've fallen and hurt my hip going to hospital. Can't watch Micah today." Janelle felt panic rising in her chest. She quickly texted back, asking if Mrs. Jenkins was okay and if she needed anything. Then reality hit her. What was she going to do with Micah? School didn't start until next week, and she had no family in the city. Her friends all worked during the day. She got off at her stop and called her backup sitter, Lisa, but there was no answer. She tried another and another. No one was available on such short notice. By the time she reached the towering glass building where Kensington Enterprises occupied the top 10 floors, Janelle had made the only decision she could. She'd have to bring Micah to work. She texted Mrs. Jenkins, asking if she could drop Micah off at the apartment to pick up his backpack with his books and toys. Mrs. Jenkins' grandson replied that he was taking his grandmother to the hospital, but would let Janelle in. An hour later, Janelle hurried through the lobby of Kensington Enterprises, holding Micah's hand tightly. She'd wasted precious morning preparation time getting him, and now she was running late. She prayed that Mr. Kensington would be delayed in traffic. "Remember what I told you, Micah. You need to be very quiet and just color or read your books. This is Mommy's workplace and it's very important." Micah nodded solemnly. "I'll be good, Mommy, I promise." The elevator doors opened to the executive floor, and Janelle quickly led Micah to her desk, situated just outside Graham Kensington's large corner office. She set up a small space for him with coloring books, a tablet with headphones, and some snacks. "Miss Carter, you're late," came a voice from behind her. Karen Phillips, the office manager, stood there with her arms crossed, eyeing Micah suspiciously. "And who is this?" "This is my son." "Micah. My babysitter had an emergency and I had no other options. He'll be very quiet, I promise. He won't disturb anyone." Karen's thin lips pressed together in disapproval. "You know the company policy on children in the workplace." "Mr. Kensington won't be pleased." "I know, but Mr. Kensington will be here in 15 minutes. The Anderson file needs to be ready, and he'll want his coffee waiting." Janelle nodded, her heart racing. "I'll take care of it right away." Karen walked away, but not before giving Micah another disapproving look. Janelle knelt beside her son. "Sweetie, I need to prepare some things. Just stay right here and color, okay? Don't leave this spot." "Okay, Mommy," Micah said, already opening his coloring book. Janelle rushed to get everything ready. She prepared. The Anderson file, printed the meeting notes, and hurried to the break room to make Graham's coffee. Black with 1 sugar, exactly how he liked it. By the time the elevator dinged announcing his arrival, she was back at her desk, coffee in hand. Graham Kensington stepped off the elevator, looking every bit the powerful CEO he was. Tall and imposing in his perfectly tailored dark blue suit, he had piercing blue eyes that seemed to notice every detail and find every flaw. At 42, his dark hair was just beginning to gray at the temples, giving him a distinguished look that commanded respect. The office fell silent, as it always did when he arrived. Everyone straightened a little, worked a little faster. Janelle stood up, holding his coffee and the Anderson file. "Good morning, Mr. Kensington," she said, trying to sound normal despite her anxiety. "Here's your coffee and the file for the 10 o'clock meeting." Graham barely nodded as he took both. His eyes flicked to her desk, where Micah sat quietly coloring. "Who is that?" he asked, his voice cool. Before Janelle could answer, something unexpected happened. Micah looked up, his eyes widening. He dropped his crayon and stood up, a huge smile spreading across his face. "Daddy," he exclaimed, running toward Graham with arms outstretched. The entire office seemed to freeze. Karen gasped. Someone dropped a stack of papers. Janelle felt all the blood drain from her face as her son wrapped his small arms around Graham Kensington's waist and looked up at him with pure joy. "Micah!" Janelle rushed forward, mortified. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Kensington. I don't know why but something strange was happening." Graham hadn't pushed Micah away. Instead, he was staring down at the little boy with an expression Janelle had never seen before. Confusion mixed with something else, something softer than she'd ever witnessed on his usually stern face. Graham set his coffee and the file on Janelle's desk and, to everyone's shock, knelt down to Micah's level. "Why did you call me that?" he asked, his voice gentler than anyone in the office had ever heard it. Micah, completely unfazed by the tension around him, simply shrugged and smiled. "You look like my daddy in my dreams." The silence in the office was deafening. Janelle wanted to disappear. She'd surely be fired now. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Kensington," she said, reaching for Micah. "My regular sitter had an emergency, and I had nowhere else to take him. I promise it won't happen again." Graham stood up slowly, his eyes moving from Micah to Janelle, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. How long had she worked for him? 3 years. And yet he realized he knew almost nothing about her personal life. "You have a son," he said, stating the obvious. "Yes, sir. He's 5. Graham looked around, suddenly aware of the entire office watching them. His expression hardened again. "In my office, Miss Carter," he said, picking up his coffee and file. "Bring your son." Janelle's heart pounded as she took Micah's hand and followed Graham into his expansive corner office. The glass walls offered no privacy from the curious eyes of her co-workers. Graham closed the door behind them and walked to his desk. "Sir, I can explain. You're a single mother," he said. Not a question, but a statement. "Yes, sir." Graham studied Micah, who was now looking around the office with interest. "You have a big office," Micah said, apparently unaware of the tension. "My mom says you're very important." Something flickered across Graham's face. Surprise, perhaps. "Does she?" Janelle's cheeks burned. "Mr. Kensington, please, I had no choice today. It won't happen again, I promise." Graham sat down in his leather chair and leaned back, still looking at Micah, rather than at her. "Where's his father?" The question caught her off guard. He's not in the picture, sir." "Never has been," she wanted to add, but didn't. Micah's father had disappeared as soon as she'd told him she was pregnant, wanting nothing to do with the responsibility of a child. Graham nodded, then finally looked at her. "I have a conference room not being used today. He can stay there while you work." Janelle blinked, not sure she'd heard correctly. "You're not firing me for having a childcare emergency?" "No, Miss Carter. Contrary to office gossip, I'm not." Completely heartless. There was a slight edge to his voice. "However, I expect this will be a one-time occurrence." "Of course, sir. Thank you. The Anderson meeting is in an hour. I need those projections finalized." "I'll have them ready, sir." Graham turned his attention to his computer, a clear dismissal. Janelle took Micah's hand and started toward the door. "Ms. Carter," Graham called, stopping her. "What's his name again?" "Micah, sir." Graham looked at the boy once more, his expression unreadable. "Micah," he repeated softly. Then his face hardened again as he turned back to his work. "That will be all." Janelle set Micah up in the small conference room with his books and tablet, making sure he had snacks and water. "Be good." "Okay, Mommy has to work. Is that man really not my daddy?" Micah asked, his voice small. Janelle's heart ached. "No, sweetie, that's my boss, Mr. Kensington." "But he looks like the daddy in my dreams," Micah insisted. Janelle didn't know what to say to that. Micah had never even seen a picture of his real father. "Sometimes dreams are just dreams, honey. You stay here and be good, and maybe we can get ice cream after work." The promise of ice cream brightened Micah's mood immediately, and Janelle returned to her desk, still shaken by the morning's events. To her surprise, Karen approached almost immediately. "I can't believe he didn't fire you on the spot," she said, glancing toward Graham's office. "I've never seen him act like that before." "Like what? Like human?" Karen shook her head. "Just don't push your luck. Get those projections done." Throughout the morning, Janelle checked on Micah regularly while trying to keep up with her work. She noticed Graham watching her through the glass walls of his office more than once, his expression thoughtful. When she brought the finished projections to him, he barely looked at her, but as she turned to leave, he spoke. "How do you do it, Ms. Carter?" She turned back. "Do what, sir?" "All of this. Working these hours, raising a child alone." The question seemed genuine, not judgmental. Janelle shrugged slightly. "I don't have a choice, sir. Micah is my responsibility, my priority." Graham nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "Your dedication is admirable." The compliment, if that's what it was, surprised her. "Thank you, sir." "Bring him to the staff lunch today," Graham said suddenly. "There's always too much food anyway." Before Janelle could respond, his phone rang, and he turned away to answer it. She left his office, puzzled by his behavior. The staff lunch was held in the large conference room every Friday. It was usually a tense affair, with Graham sitting at the head of the table, barely speaking as everyone ate in awkward silence. Today, Janelle brought Micah in, holding his hand tightly and feeling everyone's eyes on them. "Sit here, sweetie," she said, placing him in a chair next to hers as far from Graham as possible. But as the food was being served, Graham surprised everyone by standing up. "Everyone, this is Micah, Ms. Carter's son. He's joining us today due to special circumstances." The room fell silent as Graham walked around the table to where Micah sat. He knelt down again, meeting the boy's eyes. "I understand you like ice cream," he said. Micah's eyes widened. "Yes, Mommy said we might get some after work." Graham actually smiled, a small, tight smile, but a smile nonetheless. Several employees exchanged shocked glances. "What's your favorite flavor?" Graham asked. "Chocolate chip," Micah answered enthusiastically. "Mine too," Graham said, then stood and returned to his seat, acting as if the exchange had never happened. Throughout lunch, Janelle noticed Graham watching Micah, the way he laughed, the way he carefully ate his food, the way he whispered questions to his mother. There was something in Graham's eyes she couldn't quite identify, something that made her uneasy and curious at the same time. After lunch, as everyone filed out, Graham stopped Janelle at the door. "Ms. Carter, a word." She told Micah to wait just outside and turned to face her boss, bracing herself. "Is everything okay, sir?" Graham hesitated, something she'd never seen him do before. "Your son, he seems like a good kid." "He is," she said, feeling a rush of pride despite her nervousness. "You've never mentioned him before." "You've never asked, sir," she replied, before she could stop herself. To her surprise, Graham nodded, accepting the gentle rebuke. "Fair enough." He paused. "Do you need to leave early today? To take him for ice cream?" Janelle stared at him, completely thrown off balance by this new side of him. I can finish all my work first, sir. It's Friday, Miss Carter. The weekend reports can wait until Monday for once. Thank you, sir, that's very kind. Graham's expression shifted back to his usual businesslike demeanor. I expect you here early on Monday to make up for today. Of course, sir. As Janelle turned to leave, Graham spoke again. Miss Carter. She looked back at him. He has your eyes. The simple observation, delivered in Graham's usual matter-of-fact tone, caught her off guard. Before she could respond, he had already turned away, ending the conversation. Outside, Micah was waiting patiently. Can we go for ice cream now, Mommy? Yes, sweetie, Mr. Kensington said we can leave early today. Micah beamed. I like him. He's nice. He's not usually, Janelle began, then stopped herself. Yes, he was nice today. As they walked toward the elevator, Janelle felt Graham's eyes on them through the glass walls of the conference room. When she glanced back, their eyes met briefly, before he looked away. That evening, as Janelle tucked Micah into bed, he asked a question that made her heart skip a beat. Will I see Mr. Kensington again, Mommy? He's my boss, sweetie. You'll probably see him sometimes. Micah yawned, his eyes heavy with sleep. Good. In my dream, he makes you smile a lot. Janelle kissed his forehead, brushing back his curls. It's just a dream, Micah. Real life is different. But as she turned off the light and closed his door, something stirred inside her, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in years. She pushed it away immediately. Graham Kensington was her boss, a powerful, wealthy man who lived in a world completely different from hers. Today had been an anomaly, nothing more. Still, as she sat alone in her small living room, she couldn't help but remember the way he had looked at Micah, the gentleness in his voice when he spoke to him. For a fleeting moment, she had glimpsed something in Graham Kensington that no one at the office had ever seen before, a glimpse of the man behind the intimidating facade. Little did she know, across town in his luxurious penthouse apartment, Graham Kensington stood at his window, looking out at the city lights, thinking about a little boy with curly hair who had called him Daddy, and the mother who had somehow managed to remain invisible to him for 3 years, despite seeing her every day. Something had changed today, though neither of them realized just how significant that change would be. The morning sun streamed through the glass walls of the beach house, waking Tasha from the deepest sleep she'd had in months. For a moment, she was disoriented, expecting to see the hotel room in Jamaica, where she and Marcus should have been starting their honeymoon. Instead, she found herself in Nate Sinclair's luxurious beach house, wrapped in expensive sheets that smelled of fabric softener and ocean air. She sat up and looked out at the waves crashing against the shore. It had been 3 days since she'd fled her wedding, 3 days of blessed solitude and silence. She'd turned off her phone after sending a brief text to her mother. I'm safe, I need time, please respect that. Then she'd disconnected from the world, spending her days walking on the beach, reading books from Nate's shelves, and thinking, really thinking, about what she wanted from her life. The landline phone rang, startling her. Only Nate had this number. Hello, she answered, suddenly aware that she was still in her pajamas at 11 in the morning. Good morning, runaway bride. Nate's deep voice came through the line. Just checking to make sure you haven't been swept out to sea. Tasha smiled despite herself. Still here, still figuring things out. How's that going? His voice was casual, but she sensed genuine interest behind the question. Slowly, she admitted. But better than I expected. Thank you again for letting me stay here. No thanks needed. There was a pause. Actually, I'm calling because I need to come down there today. Some paperwork I left in the study. Would that be all right with you? Tasha felt a flutter of something in her stomach. Nervousness? Anticipation? Of course, it's your house. I'll be there around 4. And, Tasha, I'm bringing groceries, so be thinking about what kind of dinner you'd like. Before she could respond, he'd hung up. Tasha stared at the phone for a moment, then looked around at the disheveled living room. Books and magazines were scattered across the coffee table, and her borrowed clothes were draped over chairs. She'd made herself at home, perhaps too much. So suddenly energized, she spent the next few hours cleaning and tidying, then took a long shower. As she dried her hair, she found herself spending more time on her appearance than she had in days. Just because you want to look presentable she told herself, not because you care what Nate Sinclair thinks of you, but deep down, she knew that wasn't entirely true. Meanwhile, across town at the Washington family home, Marcus sat in his mother's living room, his head in his hands. 3 days, and still no word from Tasha beyond that one cryptic text to her mother. She'll come to her senses, his mother, Vivian Washington, said firmly. She was a formidable woman, president of the local church's women's auxiliary, and a respected figure in their community. That girl just got cold feet. It happens. You didn't see her face, Mom, Marcus said quietly. She looked relieved when she ran. The memory still stung. He'd been waiting at the altar, watched the back doors of the church open, and then the commotion. Tasha, his Tasha, climbing out a window and running down the street in her wedding dress like she was escaping a fire. Oh, well, she embarrassed this entire family, Vivian sniffed. Pastor Williams is still talking about it, and the money we spent on that reception. Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, a text from Tasha's mother. Still no word. Her bank card hasn't been used. I'm worried. He showed it to his mother, who frowned. That's strange. Where would she go with no money? Who would help her? Her eyes narrowed. Unless there's another man involved. Tasha wouldn't cheat, Marcus said automatically. But a seed of doubt had been planted. Tasha had been distant these past few months, working late, going out with friends he'd never met. Had she been seeing someone else all along? The thought made his blood boil. I'm going to find her, he said, standing up. And when I do, she's going to have a lot of explaining to do. Back at the beach house, Tasha was sitting on the deck, lost in thought, when she heard a car pull up. Nate emerged with several grocery bags, looking even more handsome than she remembered in casual clothes, dark jeans and a light blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms. Need help? She called, walking down. To meet him. I've got it, he replied, but he handed her a bag anyway. How's the solitude treating you? Better than expected, Tasha admitted as they walked into the house together. I've done a lot of thinking. Dangerous pastime, Nate said, with a slight smile. Come to any conclusions? Tasha helped him unpack the groceries, noticing he'd brought fresh vegetables, 2 nice steaks, a bottle of wine, and ingredients for a proper meal. A few. I need to find a new place to live for starters, and I should probably call Marcus. At some point, Nate raised an eyebrow. The abandoned groom, that should be an interesting conversation. He deserves an explanation at least. She paused. What I'm struggling with is how to explain something I don't fully understand myself. I just knew I couldn't marry him. Nate began chopping vegetables with surprising skill. Sometimes our instincts know better than our minds. What does your gut tell you about why you ran? Tasha leaned against the counter, watching him work. That? I was disappearing, becoming someone I didn't recognize. She looked down at her hands. Marcus never really wanted me. He wanted the idea of me, the perfect wife who would make him look good, support his ambitions, never question his decisions. And that's not you? Parts of it are. I do want to support someone I love, but I also want to be seen, to matter as more than an accessory. She felt a lump forming in her throat. The day before the wedding, he was going through last-minute details and said something about how we'd need to postpone having children because it would interfere with his promotion timeline. He never even asked what I wanted. Nate looked up from his chopping. And what do you want? Children? Career? Both? I don't know yet, Tasha admitted. That's part of the problem. I've spent so long trying to be what other people wanted that I've lost track of my own desires. She picked up a knife and started helping with the vegetables. What about you? You have this beautiful house, clearly successful. Wife, girlfriend? Neither, Nate said, reaching for the wine and opening it with practiced ease. Work keeps me busy. Too busy for relationships? Tasha asked, accepting the glass of wine he offered. Too busy for complicated ones. He gave her a look that made her heart beat a little faster. I know what I want, and I don't have time for games. There was something in the way he said it that made Tasha want to know more, but before she could ask, Nate changed the subject. So, runaway bride, aside from hiding out at my beach house, what's your next move? Tasha sipped her wine, considering. I need to find a place to stay in the city. My apartment's been sublet, and I can't exactly go back to Marcus's place to get my things. You could stay at my place in the city, Nate offered casually, as if he weren't suggesting something extraordinary. I have 3 guest rooms that never get used. I couldn't impose like that, Tasha protested. You've already done so much. It's not an imposition if I'm offering, Nate said, meeting her eyes. Besides, it would give you time to get back on your feet. Find a new apartment, figure out your life, no strings attached. Tasha felt a flutter of something between excitement and caution. Why are you being so kind to me? You don't even know me. Nate was quiet for a moment, focused on seasoning the steaks. Let's just say I recognize someone at a crossroads. I've been there myself. He glanced up at her. And maybe I'm curious to see what you'll do next. The evening progressed into one of the most pleasant Tasha could remember. They cooked together, talked, laughed. Nate told her about his business. He owned a successful tech company that developed security software, and Tasha shared stories from her job at the community college. It's not glamorous, she admitted, but I like helping the students, especially the older ones coming back to school. They're so determined. Like you, Nate observed. It takes courage to run from a wedding. Most people would just go through with it, even knowing it was wrong. The compliment warmed her, and Tasha realized she was enjoying herself more than she had in years. There was an ease with Nate that she'd never felt with Marcus, a sense that she could be herself without fear of disapproval. After dinner, they moved to the deck with their wine glasses, watching the moon rise over the ocean. This is a magical place, Tasha said softly. I can see why you keep it. Do you come here often? Not as much as I should, Nate admitted. Work always seems to get in the way. He turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. You know, you never told me exactly what happened. Why you were running in a wedding dress through downtown. Tasha took a deep breath, deciding he deserved the full story. I was in the back room of the church, all dressed up, waiting to walk down the aisle. And suddenly I couldn't breathe. It was like I was watching myself about to jump off a cliff. She shook her head at the memory. I just knew I couldn't do it. So I climbed out. The window. Bold move, Nate said, amusement in his eyes. More like desperate, Tasha admitted. I ran without thinking. When I saw your car, it was pure instinct. She looked at him curiously. Why did you help me? Most people would have kicked me out or driven me to the police station. Nate was quiet for a long moment. The look in your eyes, he finally said. I recognized it. Fear, yes, but also determination. You weren't running away from something as much as running towards something else. Your freedom, maybe. His insight startled her. That's exactly it. They sat in comfortable silence for a while until Nate's phone buzzed. He checked it and frowned. Work? Tasha asked. Unfortunately. He stood reluctantly. I need to handle this. Feel free to stay up, enjoy the night. Later, as Tasha was getting ready for bed, she heard Nate on the phone in the study, his voice rising with frustration. I don't care what he's offering, James. The answer is no. Tell Thompson we're not interested in a merger. A pause. Because I built this company from nothing, and I'm not about to let some corporate vulture dismantle it for parts. Another pause. Fine. Set up the meeting for next week, but don't expect me to change my mind. Tasha moved away, not wanting to eavesdrop, but the intensity in Nate's voice stayed with her. She'd seen only the charming, generous side of him until now. This glimpse of the fierce businessman was intriguing, and if she was honest with herself, attractive. The next morning, Tasha woke to find Nate already up, working on his laptop at the kitchen counter. Morning, he said without looking up. There's coffee. Thanks. She poured herself a cup, noticing the tension in his shoulders. Everything okay? I couldn't help overhearing some of your call last night. Nate sighed, closing his laptop. Just business. A larger company trying to buy mine out. The usual corporate dance. You don't want to sell? Tasha asked, sitting across from him. No, his response was firm. I built SecureTech from the ground up. Richard Thompson, the CEO of the company trying to buy us, he doesn't care about what we've created. He just wants our client list and our patents. So you'll fight. Nate looked at her with surprise, as if he hadn't expected her to understand. Yes, I will. Good, Tasha said simply. Some things are worth fighting for. Something shifted in Nate's expression. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. Yes, they are. The moment was interrupted by the landline ringing. Nate answered it, his expression changing as he listened. Yes, she's here, he said, looking at Tasha. No, I'm not holding her against her will. That's ridiculous. He held out the phone to Tasha. It's for you, someone named Layla. Tasha felt her stomach drop. Layla was her cousin and best friend, the only person who might have guessed where she was. She took the phone with a shaking hand. Hello? Tasha Bennett, what in the world are you doing? Layla's voice was a mix of relief and anger. We've been worried sick, and who is this man you're staying with? How did you find me? Tasha asked, avoiding the question. I saw you get into his car that day. I remembered part of the license. Plate and described him to people. It took some doing, but I finally found someone who recognized the description. Nathaniel Sinclair, the tech millionaire. Tasha, have you lost your mind? I'm fine, Layla. I just needed some time to think. Well, while you've been thinking, all hell has broken loose back here. Marcus is furious, your mother is beside herself, and half the church thinks you've had some kind of nervous breakdown. Tasha felt her resolve weakening. I'm sorry for worrying everyone, but I had to get away. You could have called, Layla said, her voice softening, just to let us know you were safe. I know, I'm sorry. Tasha glanced at Nate, who was pretending not to listen as he made more coffee. I'll come back soon, I promise. You'd better. And Tasha, Marcus has been asking a lot of questions about who you might have run off with. He's convinced there's another man. There's not, Tasha said automatically, but as she looked at Nate, she wasn't sure that was entirely true anymore. Not that anything had happened, but she couldn't deny the connection she felt with him. After hanging up, she explained the situation to Nate. I should go back, she said reluctantly. Face the music. Nate nodded slowly. If you feel ready. He paused. My offer still stands. You're welcome to stay at my place in the city until you sort things out. Tasha hesitated. The sensible thing would be to go back, apologize to everyone, find her own place, and start rebuilding her life independently. But the thought of Nate's place of continuing this unexpected connection with him was tempting. I think I need to do this on my own, she finally said, but thank you for everything. Nate's expression was unreadable. I understand. I'll drive you back this afternoon. The drive back to the city was quieter than the drive out had been. Tasha was lost in thoughts about what awaited her, the explanations, the judgment, the difficult conversations. Nate seemed preoccupied as well, occasionally checking his phone at stoplights, his expression growing more frustrated each time. Bad news? Tasha finally asked. Thompson's moved up the meeting, Nate said grimly. He's playing hardball. When's the meeting? Tomorrow morning. He glanced at her. Actually, I could use a favor. What kind of favor? Tasha asked cautiously. Come with me to the meeting. Seeing her surprise, he quickly added, not as a participant, just as moral support, I guess. I know it sounds strange, but having you there would throw Thompson off his game. He's expecting me to come alone, vulnerable. And I'm what? Your secret weapon? Tasha couldn't help but smile at the absurdity of it, something like that. Nate's expression was serious despite his light tone. Look, you're sharp, you're observant. You might notice things I miss while I'm focused on the negotiation, and after, I'll help you figure out your next steps. Win-win. Tasha considered. One more day of postponing the inevitable confrontations, one more day with Nate, and she was curious about this part of his life. Okay, she agreed. One meeting, then I face my real life. Deal, Nate said, and there was relief in his voice. What neither of them knew was that Marcus Washington was at that very moment sitting in a private investigator's office, looking at photos of Tasha getting into Nate's car outside the church. Want to know everything about this man, Marcus said, his voice cold with fury. Everything, the PI nodded, making notes. Nathaniel Sinclair, CEO of Secure Tech, self-made millionaire, never married, no children. He looked up at Marcus. Very private individual, this won't be easy. I don't care what it costs, Marcus said. I want to know why my fiancée left me for him. And then I want them both to pay. As Nate's car approached the city, Tasha looked out at the skyline, unaware of the storm brewing behind her. She had run from one life into another, and both were now on a collision course. The question was, when they collided, what or who would be left standing? Nate glanced over at her, his expression softening. Having second thoughts? About coming back? Maybe. She looked at him. But not about running that day, that was the right decision. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that save us. As they drove into the city, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the streets. The end of one day, the beginning of another chapter. Tasha didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in years, she felt ready to face it, whatever it might be. Tasha woke up in another unfamiliar bed, this time in Nate's city penthouse. Despite her intentions to face her old life immediately, she'd accepted his offer to stay the night when they arrived back in the city too late to make other arrangements. The guest room was larger than her entire former apartment, with floor-to-ceiling, windows overlooking the city skyline. Just one night, she told herself, just to prepare for the meeting today, then she would call her family and begin the difficult process of explaining her actions. She showered and dressed in clothes Nate had bought for her on the way back, a simple but elegant navy blue dress that fit her perfectly. She wondered briefly how he'd guessed her size so accurately, then pushed the thought aside as she made her way to the kitchen. Nate was already there, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, his attention focused on the tablet in front of him as he sipped his coffee. "Morning," she said, helping herself to coffee from the pot. He looked up and something flickered in his eyes as he took in her appearance. "Good morning. Sleep well?" "Better than I expected," Tasha admitted. "Though I'm a little nervous about this meeting. I'm not sure how much help I'll be." "Just having you there will be enough," Nate said. "Thompson is expecting me to come alone, already defeated. The surprise of having someone with me might throw him off balance." Tasha raised an eyebrow. "So I'm a distraction." "A strategic advantage," Nate corrected with a slight smile. "Besides, you're smart and observant. You might notice things I miss." An hour later, they were walking into the gleaming glass headquarters of Thompson Industries. Nate had briefed her on the basics during the ride over. Richard Thompson wanted to acquire SecureTech, Nate's company, primarily for its innovative security software and impressive client list. Thompson had been making increasingly aggressive moves, from trying to poach Nate's top employees to pressuring his investors. "Mr. Sinclair," the receptionist greeted them. "Mr. Thompson is expecting you," and she glanced at Tasha questioningly. "Ms. Bennett is with me," Nate said firmly, his hand resting lightly on Tasha's lower back as he guided her toward the elevator. As they rode up to the top floor, Tasha felt Nate's tension. She placed a hand on his arm. "You've built something valuable. Don't let him intimidate you." Nate looked down at her, surprise and gratitude in his eyes. "I won't." The conference room was intimidating, all glass and chrome with views of the city that made it clear who held the power here. Richard Thompson stood as they entered, his surprise at seeing Tasha quickly masked by a practiced smile. "Nathaniel," Thompson said, extending his hand. He was older than Nate, around 50, with silver hair and the confident bearing of a man accustomed to getting his way. "And who is your lovely companion?" "Tasha Bennett," Nate replied before she could speak. "My advisor?" Thompson's eyebrows rose slightly. "I wasn't aware you brought advisors to these meetings. James certainly didn't mention it." He nodded toward a nervous-looking man Tasha assumed was Nate's lawyer. "Last-minute decision," Nate said smoothly. "Shall we begin?" The meeting was tense from the start. Thompson laid out his offer, which Tasha could tell from Nate's subtle reactions was insultingly low. "Your company has potential, Nathaniel," Thompson said, leaning back in his chair. "But let's be honest, you're facing significant challenges. The market is shifting, your latest product launch was delayed, and several key clients are considering other options." "Interesting that you would know about private conversations with our clients," Nate said coolly, almost as if someone had been making calls, spreading misinformation. Thompson smiled, not denying the accusation. "Business is business. My offer is fair given the circumstances." "Your offer undervalues my company by at least 40%, Nate replied. And we both know it. Perhaps, Thompson conceded. But think about your employees, Nathaniel. Under my leadership, secure tech could expand globally. More opportunities. For everyone. Under your leadership, half my team would be laid off within 6 months and our technology would be stripped for parts, Nate countered. Tasha had been quiet, observing the exchange, when she noticed something. Every time Thompson mentioned specific details about secure tech's operations, he glanced briefly at a thin folder in front of him. A folder that hadn't been there when they first sat down. She wrote a note on the pad in front of her and slid it discreetly to Nate. He has inside information. The folder appeared after his assistant came in. Nate read it, his expression unchanged, but his hand briefly squeezed hers under the table in acknowledgement. "Mr. Thompson," Nate said, his tone shifting. "I'm curious. How did you learn about our server issues last month? We kept that information internal." Thompson's smile faltered for a split second. "Industry talk, you know how it is. And our negotiations with Apex Corporation, that was confidential as well." "I have my sources," Thompson said, his confidence returning. "Information is power in our business. Perhaps if your security was better, I wouldn't know so much about your operations." "Or perhaps," Nate said, standing slowly, "if you weren't paying someone inside my company for information, you wouldn't know these things." Thompson's face hardened. "That's a serious accusation, Nathaniel." "Yes, it is." Nate gathered his papers. "And one I intend to investigate thoroughly. This meeting is over, and my answer is still no." As they left the conference room, Tasha could feel Thompson's eyes on them, calculating and cold. "That could have gone better," James muttered as they entered the elevator. "Actually, it went exactly as I hoped," Nate said. "Thanks to Tasha, we now know for certain that Thompson has a mole in my company." James looked at her with new respect. "The folder?" She nodded. It appeared halfway through the meeting, and he kept checking it whenever he mentioned specific details about secure tech. "Smart observation," James said. "But what now? Thompson isn't going to back off just because you walked out." "Now we find the leak," Nate said grimly. "And plug it." Back in Nate's car, Tasha felt the adrenaline of the confrontation wearing off, replaced by the reality of her situation. She'd fulfilled her promise, attended the meeting, and now it was time to face her own problems. "Thank you," Nate said as they pulled away from Thompson's building. "You were right about the folder. I was too focused on what he was saying to notice." "Sometimes it helps to have a fresh perspective," Tasha said. She hesitated, then added, "I should call my family. Let them know I'm coming home." Nate nodded, but she could sense his reluctance. "Of course. Do you want me to drop you somewhere specific?" Before she could answer, her phone rang. It was Layla. "Tasha, where are you? You need to come home right away." "I'm planning to," Tasha assured her. "What's wrong?" "It's your mother. She collapsed yesterday. She's in the hospital." Tasha felt the blood drain from her face. "What? Is she okay?" "The doctors say it was just exhaustion and stress, but she's asking for you." "And Tasha?" Layla hesitated. "Marcus has been here. He's not himself. He's convinced you left him for another man." Tasha met Nate's concerned gaze. "I'll be there. As soon as I can. Which hospital?" After getting the details, she hung up, her hands shaking. "My mother's in the hospital. Stress, they think." She swallowed hard. "Because of me." "That's not your fault," Nate said firmly, already changing direction to head toward the hospital. "You didn't put her there." "Didn't I?" "I'm the one who ran away, who disappeared without explaining." "You needed time," Nate insisted. "That's not a crime." But guilt was already settling in Tasha's chest like a heavy weight. She'd been so focused on her own freedom, her own needs, that she hadn't fully considered the impact on her family, especially her mother, who had always worried about everything. When they arrived at the hospital, Tasha hesitated before getting out of the car. "You don't have to come in." "I know," Nate said, "but I'm not leaving you to face this alone." His words touched her more than she wanted to admit. Marcus had always been conveniently busy when she needed emotional support. They found her mother's room easily. Layla was sitting beside the bed while Tasha's father paced by the window. When Tasha entered, her mother's face crumpled with relief and tears. "Tasha," Oh, thank God. Tasha rushed to the bed, embracing her mother carefully around the IV tubes. I'm so sorry, Mom. I never meant to worry you like this. Her father's expression was a mixture of relief and disappointment. Where have you been, young lady? Do you have any idea what you've put us through? Before Tasha could answer, her mother noticed Nate standing in the doorway. Who is this? She asked, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. This is Nathaniel Sinclair, Tasha said, taking a deep breath. He's a friend who helped me when I needed it. A friend, her father repeated, his tone making it clear he didn't believe her. So this is the man you left Marcus for? I didn't leave Marcus for anyone, Tasha said firmly. I left because marrying him would have been a mistake for both of us. He's devastated, her mother said weakly. He's been here every day, bringing me flowers, checking on me. Such a good man. Tasha felt a flash of irritation. Even now, they were defending Marcus, putting his feelings above hers. Mom, I know you like Marcus, but you don't know what our relationship was really like. He wanted to control everything. What I wore, who I spent time with, even when we would have children. I would have disappeared inside that marriage. Her mother looked away, clearly unconvinced. You could have talked to him about your concerns, instead of humiliating him in front of everyone we know. I tried, Tasha said, fighting to keep her voice steady. For months, he never listened. Her father was studying Nate with open suspicion. And how exactly did you two meet? On the day of the wedding, I assume? Nate stepped forward, his presence somehow filling the small hospital room. Yes, sir. Your daughter needed help, and I was in a position to offer it. Nothing more. Nothing more, her father echoed skeptically. Yet here you are, days later, still together. Dad, please, Tasha began, but was interrupted by the door opening. Marcus stood there, a bouquet of flowers in his hand, his expression changing from concern to shock to anger as he took in the scene before him. So it's true, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. You did leave me for someone else. Marcus, Tasha said, stepping toward him, it's not what you think, isn't it? His gaze moved to Nate, sizing him up. Nathaniel Sinclair, the tech millionaire. Was I not rich enough? For you, Tasha. Not powerful enough? This has nothing to do with money, Tasha protested. Of course it does, Marcus said bitterly. I've had you investigated, Sinclair. I know all about you. Self-made millionaire, CEO of secure tech, never stays with a woman longer than a few months. He turned back to Tasha. Is that what you want? To be his latest conquest? Nate tensed beside her, and Tasha could feel the situation spiraling out of control. That's enough, her father said firmly. This is a hospital room, not a boxing. Ring. Margaret needs rest, not more stress. Marcus's expression immediately shifted to contrition as he approached Tasha's mother. Of course, Mrs. Bennett. I'm so sorry. I just wasn't expecting... He glared at Nate again. Perhaps we should continue this conversation elsewhere, Nate suggested, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of steel. There's nothing to discuss, Marcus said coldly. Tasha made her choice. I just hope she realizes what she's giving up. He placed the flowers on the bedside table. I'll come back later, Mrs. Bennett, when you have fewer visitors. After he left, the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. I should go, Nate said quietly to Tasha. Give you time with your family. Part of her wanted to protest, to keep him there as a buffer against her parents' disappointment and questions. But she knew this was a conversation she needed to have alone. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. He squeezed her hand briefly. Call me if you need anything at all. After Nate left, Tasha braced herself for the interrogation she knew was coming. Start from the beginning, her father said, his voice stern but not unkind. What really happened? So Tasha told them everything. Her growing doubts, the feeling of suffocation as the wedding approached, the panic that had driven her to flee. She didn't mention the beach house, saying only that Nate had given her a place to stay while she sorted things out. I'm sorry for how I handled it, she concluded. I should have been honest sooner, with all of you, with Marcus. But I'm not. Sorry for the decision itself. Her mother's expression had softened somewhat. I still don't understand, Tasha. Marcus is such a good provider. He would have given you security, stability. I know, Mom. But I need more than security. I need to be valued for who I am, not just what I can do for someone else. She took her mother's hand. Can you understand that? For the first time, she saw a flicker of recognition in her mother's eyes. I suppose I can, she said quietly. Your father and I, well, it hasn't always been perfect, but we respect each other. If Marcus wasn't respecting you... He wasn't, Tasha said firmly. Not in the ways that matter. Her father cleared his throat. And this Sinclair fellow, what's his role in all this? He's a friend, Dad. He helped me when I needed it most, that's all. But even as she said the words, Tasha knew they weren't entirely true. Her feelings for Nate had grown beyond friendship, though she wasn't ready to examine exactly what they had become. Later, as Tasha was leaving the hospital with a promise to return the next day, she spotted Nate's car still in the parking lot. He was waiting for her. I thought you left, she said, sliding into the passenger seat. I did, he replied with a small smile. Then I came back. Seemed like you might need a ride. The simple gesture of consideration touched her deeply. Thank you. As they drove away from the hospital, Tasha felt the tension of the day weighing on her. Marcus had you investigated, she said suddenly. That's disturbing. Not surprising. Nate replied. He sees me as a threat, a rival who took something that belonged to him. I don't belong to anyone, Tasha said firmly. No, you don't. Nate glanced at her. That's what he doesn't understand, and it's what I admire about you. The compliment warmed her. Where are we going? She asked, noticing they weren't heading. Toward Nate's penthouse. Your choice, he said. I can take you to my place or a hotel or your parents' house, wherever you want to go. Tasha considered. She wasn't ready to stay with her parents and face their continued questions and Marcus's potential visits. A hotel seemed cold and lonely after everything that had happened. Your place, she decided. Just until I figure out my next steps. Nate nodded, and she thought she detected relief in his expression. What neither of them noticed was the car that pulled out behind them, following at a discreet distance. Inside, Marcus gripped the steering wheel tightly, his face set in grim determination, as he watched them drive away together. Back at Nate's penthouse, Tasha sank onto the sofa, emotionally exhausted. Drink, Nate offered, heading to the bar cart in the corner. Please, she said. Something strong. He poured 2 whiskeys and handed one to her before sitting beside her, not too close but close enough that she could feel his warmth. You did. Well today, he said after a moment, in the meeting with Thompson and with your family. Tasha took a sip of her whiskey, welcoming the burn. Doesn't feel like it. My mother is in the hospital because of me. Marcus is on some vendetta, and my parents think I've lost my mind. Give them time, Nate advised. They love you. Eventually they'll understand you did what was necessary. I hope so. She turned to look at him. What about you? What's your next move with Thompson? Find them all in my company, Nate said, his expression hardening. Then make it clear to Thompson that Secure Tech isn't for sale, at any price. And if he doesn't back down, then I fight. Nate's voice was calm but determined. I've built this company from nothing. I won't let someone like Thompson destroy it. Tasha studied him, struck again by the different sides of the man beside her, the generous friend who had taken in a stranger in crisis, and the fierce businessman ready to battle for what he'd built. What? Nate asked, noticing her scrutiny. I'm just trying to figure you out, she admitted. Why you really helped me that day. Why you're still helping me. Nate was quiet for a moment, swirling the whiskey in his glass. When I was 19, he finally said, my parents died in a car accident. I had no other family, no real support system. I was in college on scholarship, suddenly alone and adrift. I'm so sorry, Tasha said softly. An old family friend took me in, Nate continued. Let me stay in his guest room while I figured things out. He didn't have to do that. We weren't close, but that act of kindness made all the difference. He looked at her directly. When I saw you that day running in your wedding dress, something told me you needed that kind of lifeline, someone to give you space to figure things out without judgment. And now, Tasha asked, her voice barely above a whisper, why are you still helping me? Nate set his glass down and turned toward her. Because I've come to care about what happens to you, more than I expected to. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken emotions. Tasha was acutely aware of how close. They were sitting, of the intensity in Nate's eyes. His phone rang, shattering the moment. With a barely concealed look of frustration, he checked the screen. "I have to take this, it's James." While Nate took the call in his office, Tasha tried to collect herself. What had almost happened between them? And was she ready for it, whatever it was? She was still wrestling with these questions when Nate returned, his expression grim. "What's wrong?" she asked, immediately concerned. "James thinks he's identified the mole in my company," Nate said. "Jennifer Mills, my head of development. She's been with me almost from the beginning." The betrayal was evident in his voice. "And that's not all. Thompson has called an emergency meeting with my board of directors for tomorrow. He's making a move to go around me directly to the shareholders." "Can he do that?" "Legally, yes. Ethically, it's questionable at best." Nate ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of stress. "I need to make some calls, prepare for tomorrow." "Of course," Tasha said, standing. "I should let you work." "You don't have to leave," Nate said quickly. "Just give me an hour or two." Tasha nodded, touched by his desire to keep her close despite his business crisis. "I'll be here." As Nate disappeared into his office again, Tasha wandered to the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, looking out over the city lights. Her life had changed so dramatically in less than a week. She'd left a man at the altar, found refuge with a stranger who was quickly becoming much more than that, and now stood in the middle of a high-stakes business battle for a woman who had spent years playing it safe, avoiding conflict and going along with others' expectations. It was a profound shift. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt more alive than she had in years. Her phone buzzed with a text from Layla. "Marcus is acting strange, asking lots of questions about Sinclair. Be careful." Tasha frowned at the message. Marcus had never been the jealous type before. Controlling. Yes, but not jealous. What was he planning? Outside the penthouse building, Marcus sat in his car, watching the lights of Nate's top-floor apartment. The private investigator had delivered a detailed report on Sinclair's daily routine, his business troubles, his address. Everything Marcus needed. "Enjoy your time with her," Marcus muttered, his eyes fixed on the distant windows. "It won't last long, not once I'm finished with you." Back in the penthouse, Tasha shivered suddenly, a strange foreboding washing over her. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to shake off the feeling that something was coming, something that would test her newfound courage to its limits. Nate emerged from his office, looking weary but determined. "Sorry about that," he said. "Crisis somewhat contained, at least until tomorrow's meeting." "Is there anything I can do to help?" Tasha asked. Nate hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Actually, yes. Come to the meeting with me tomorrow." "Like today?" she asked, surprised. "As your advisor?" "As yourself," Nate said. "The board knows I'm not married, not involved with anyone seriously, but if they think I'm in a stable relationship, it might help counter Thompson's narrative. That I'm too unpredictable, too much of a risk-taker to lead the company through the next phase of growth." Tasha raised her eyebrows. "So you want me to pretend to be your girlfriend for business reasons?" "Not pretend exactly," Nate said, stepping closer to her. "Just accelerate the timeline a bit." "The timeline of what?" Tasha asked, her heart beating faster. "Of us," Nate said simply. "I think we both know there's something happening here, Tasha, something real." Before she could respond, he closed the distance between them and kissed her, gently at first, then with growing intensity as she responded. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "That wasn't just for show," Nate said softly. "In case you were wondering." "I wasn't," Tasha replied, her hands still resting on his chest. "But Nate, this is complicated. I just left a man at the altar a few days ago. My life is in chaos, and you're fighting for your company. The timing is terrible," he finished for her. "I know, but I also know that from the moment you jumped into my car in that wedding dress, something changed for me, and I think for you too." Tasha couldn't deny it. Despite all the reasons she should walk away, should take time to find herself before starting. Something new, she was drawn to Nate in a way she'd never experienced before. "Come to the meeting," Nate said. "After that, we can figure out what this is, what we want it to be. No pressure, No expectations. Tasha took a deep breath. Okay, she agreed. One more meeting. Later that night, as Tasha lay in the guest bed, her mind too full for sleep, her phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. He's using you. Ask him about Rebecca Turner. Ask him what happened to the last woman who trusted him. She stared at the message, a cold feeling settling in her stomach. Who was Rebecca Turner? And who had sent this warning? Down the hall, Nate too was awake, looking at surveillance footage from his company's server room. Jennifer Mills was there, copying files onto a drive at 2 a.m. when she thought no one would notice. The betrayal stung, but it was the timing that worried him. Thompson must be planning something big for tomorrow's meeting. As the city slept around them, both Tasha and Nate faced uncertain futures, separately and possibly together. But forces were gathering, secrets were surfacing, and the simple escape that had brought them together was about to become much more complicated. Tasha stared at her phone screen in the early morning light, the mysterious text message still open. He's using you. Ask him about Rebecca Turner. Ask him what happened to the last woman who trusted him. Who was Rebecca Turner? And who had sent this warning? The number wasn't one she recognized. It had to be Marcus. Who else would try to drive? A wedge between her and Nate. But something about the message made her uneasy. What if there was truth to it? She heard movement in the kitchen and put her phone away. She dressed carefully in another outfit Nate had purchased for her, a cream-colored pantsuit that was professional but flattering. Today was important for him, and despite her misgivings about the text, she'd promised to help. Morning, Nate said when she entered the kitchen. He was already dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, looking every inch the powerful CEO. Coffee? Please. She accepted the mug he offered, studying his face. He seemed focused, calm even. But she could sense the tension beneath the surface. Ready for today? As ready as I'll ever be. He leaned against the counter. Thompson's going to try to convince my board that I'm not fit to lead the company through an acquisition, that I'm too emotional, too attached to what I've built. And what will you tell them? Tasha asked. The truth. That Secure Tech is more valuable as an independent company, that Thompson will strip it for parts and lay off half the staff within a year. He took a sip of his coffee. Having you there will help. Show them I'm not the reckless bachelor Thompson is painting me as. Tasha nodded, but the text message weighed on her mind. Nate, she began hesitantly. Who is Rebecca Turner? The change. In his expression was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening around the eyes, a slight stiffening of his shoulders. Where did you hear that name? Someone sent me a text last night, warning me about you, telling me to ask about her. Nate set his coffee down slowly. Marcus, I assume? The number was blocked, but yes, probably Marcus. She waited, watching him. So, who is she? Nate was quiet for a long moment. Rebecca was my fiancée, 3 years ago. The revelation hit Tasha like a physical blow. You were engaged? You never mentioned that. It's not something I talk about. His voice was carefully controlled. It ended badly. How badly? Tasha pressed, needing to know. She was working for one of my competitors, using our relationship to get information about SecureTech's new security protocol. His expression darkened with the memory. I found out 2 weeks before the wedding, ended it immediately. I'm sorry, Tasha said, genuinely sympathetic despite her shock. That's awful. It was. Nate's eyes met hers directly. It's also why I understand trust issues, why I recognize something in you that day in the car, that look of someone who's just had their foundations shaken. Tasha absorbed this, trying to reconcile this new information with what she knew of Nate. The text implied you hurt her somehow. I didn't, Nate said firmly. I exposed her. She lost her job, her reputation in the industry. Last I heard, she moved to Europe, started over. He stepped closer to Tasha. I didn't tell you because it wasn't relevant, and because it's not exactly a story that paints me in a flattering light, being so blind to betrayal from someone I planned to marry. There was such raw honesty in his eyes that Tasha found herself believing him. Thank you for telling me. Whoever sent that text is trying to make you doubt me, Nate said. To drive a wedge between us. It almost worked, Tasha admitted. Nate took her hand. No more secrets. If you want to know something about me, just ask. Before she could respond, his phone rang. It's James, he said, checking the screen. The board meeting has been moved up. We need to leave now. The drive to Secure Tech headquarters was tense, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Tasha wondered if she was making another mistake, getting involved with a man she barely knew while still sorting through the wreckage of her last relationship. But when Nate reached over to squeeze her hand at a red light, the simple gesture reassured her in a way words couldn't. Secure Tech occupied several floors of a modern glass building downtown. As they rode the elevator up, Nate briefed her on the key players she would meet. The board is 7 people, including me. 2 are long-time. Friends who will back me no matter what. 2 are purely business-focused and could go either way. The other 2 are problems, Tasha guessed. Gilbert Monroe and Fiona West, Nate confirmed. Both have ties to Thompson's companies. They're the ones he'll be targeting. The elevator doors opened, and they stepped into a reception area where a harried-looking young man in a suit was waiting. Mr. Sinclair, thank goodness. Mr. Thompson is already here with his team. They're in the main conference room with the board. Already? Nate's expression hardened. They weren't supposed to meet without me. Monroe called it a preliminary discussion, the assistant explained, walking quickly beside them down a hallway. Legal sent me to find you. Nate's pace increased, and Tasha hurried to keep up. As they approached a set of double doors, he paused, turning to her. Ready? She nodded, straightening her shoulders. Ready. Nate pushed open the doors, and all conversation inside immediately ceased. Around a large conference table sat 9 people, Nate's board members and Richard Thompson, with 2 associates. All eyes turned to them. Sorry I'm late, Nate said smoothly, not sounding sorry at all. I wasn't aware the meeting time had changed. Again, an older man with steel-gray hair, Monroe, Tasha guessed, cleared his throat. Richard was just giving us some preliminary figures on the acquisition offer. How generous of him, Nate replied, guiding Tasha to 2 empty seats. Since we're all here now, perhaps we should start the actual meeting. This is Tasha Bennett, by the way. She'll be joining us today. Thompson's eyes narrowed slightly as he assessed Tasha. Fez Bennett, we meet again. Nathaniel didn't mention you'd be attending. Evidently, there are a lot of things that weren't mentioned about this meeting, Nate said pointedly, taking his seat at the head of the table. A woman in her 60s with immaculate silver hair and sharp blue eyes. One of the board members leaned forward. Nathaniel, perhaps you could introduce Ms. Bennett properly? Her role here isn't clear. Nate glanced at Tasha, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded almost imperceptibly. Tasha is my partner, Nate said simply, both personally and increasingly professionally. She has a keen eye for details and helped uncover some irregularities in our meeting with Mr. Thompson yesterday. The woman, Dr. Eliza Brandt, Tasha remembered from Nate's briefing, raised an eyebrow but nodded. Welcome, Ms. Bennett. I'm sure you understand our surprise. Nathaniel has always been quite private about his personal life. Some things are worth making an exception for, Nate said, his eyes on Tasha with convincing warmth. Thompson cleared his throat. As touching as this is, we have business to discuss. My offer to acquire Secure Tech is time-sensitive. The next hour was tense, with Thompson laying out his case for why the acquisition made sense financially. Nate countered with projections showing Secure Tech's potential growth as an independent company. The board members asked questions, some pointed, some clearly leading in Thompson's favor. Throughout it all, Tasha observed quietly, noting the dynamics between the players. Monroe and West were clearly in Thompson's camp, asking questions designed to make Nate look unreasonable. Dr. Brandt and a younger man named Toby Chen supported Nate, but were carefully rational in their approach. During a brief break, as refreshments were being served, Thompson approached Tasha while Nate was speaking with Dr. Brandt across the room. Ms. Bennett, Thompson said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, quite a whirlwind romance you and Nathaniel must be having. From what I understand, you only met recently. Very recently, Mr. Thompson, Tasha replied coolly. Some connections don't require years to form. Indeed, he said, studying her. Still, it's unusual for Nathaniel to bring someone into his inner circle so quickly, especially after what happened with Rebecca. So Thompson knew about Rebecca, too. Perhaps he's learned from past experiences, Tasha said, refusing to be intimidated. As we all do. One hopes. Thompson lowered his voice. Tell me, Ms. Bennett, what do you really know about Nathaniel Sinclair? About his business practices? About how he treats those who cross him? I know enough, Tasha replied, maintaining eye contact. I know he built something valuable that you want to dismantle for parts. I know he cares about his employees, not just his bottom line. And I know he doesn't use intimidation tactics like the one you're attempting right now. Thompson's smile tightened, but before he could respond, Nate appeared at Tasha's side. Is there a problem? He asked, his voice pleasant but with an edge of steel. Not at all, Thompson said smoothly. Just getting to know your partner better. He moved away to speak with Monroe. What was that about? Nate asked quietly. He mentioned Rebecca, Tasha said. He's fishing, trying to find leverage. Nate's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, the meeting was called back to order. As the discussion continued, Tasha noticed one of Thompson's associates discreetly sliding folders to Monroe and West. She caught Nate's eye and nodded slightly toward the exchange. He gave a barely perceptible nod in return. When Thompson concluded his presentation, there was a moment of silence before Nate stood. Before we proceed further, I think there's an issue we need to address, he said, his voice commanding attention. It appears that confidential information about SecureTech has been shared improperly. He looked directly at Monroe and West. The folders you just received contain details about our internal operations and development timeline for the next-gen security protocol. Information that was stolen from our servers. A murmur went around the table. That's a serious accusation, Monroe said, flushing slightly. These are standard projections for the merger. They include server issues we had last month that were never made public, Nate replied. They reference code names for projects that are only used internally, and they contain the exact figures from our confidential negotiations with Apex Corporation. He turned to Thompson. Care to explain how you came by this information, Richard? Thompson remained impressively calm. Business intelligence. Nothing illegal or improper. Interesting, Nate said. Because our head of development, Jennifer Mills, confessed this morning to copying confidential files and sharing them with your company, for a considerable sum, I might add. This caused a genuine stir. Dr. Brandt looked particularly disturbed. If this is true, it's corporate espionage, potentially criminal. We have her signed confession, James, who had been quiet until now, said, and security footage. She's been cooperating with authorities in exchange for leniency. Thompson's composed facade showed its first crack, a twitch at the corner of his mouth, a flash of anger in his eyes. This is ridiculous. A desperate attempt by Nathaniel to avoid the inevitable. SecureTech needs the resources of Thompson Industries to survive in today's market. Actually, Dr. Brandt interjected, if Nathaniel's growth projections are accurate, and they have been consistently in the past, SecureTech is positioned extraordinarily well as an independent entity. Unless you're withholding information from the board, Chen added, looking pointedly at Nate. Everything I know, the board knows, Nate stated firmly, which is more than I can say for some people in this room. His gaze moved between Monroe and West. The meeting deteriorated from there, with accusations flying and tempers rising. By the end, Thompson was barely containing his fury. Monroe and West were defensive and evasive, and the other board members were clearly troubled by the revelations. Think we've heard enough for today, Dr. Brandt finally said. The board will need time to consider all this information and to review the evidence of these improprieties. She looked at Thompson coldly. I suggest we adjourn and reconvene. Next week, as people began gathering their things, Thompson approached Nate, his voice low but intense. This isn't over, Sinclair, not by a long shot. No, it's not, Nate agreed calmly. But corporate espionage is a serious crime, Richard. I'd tread carefully if I were you. Thompson's gaze shifted to Tasha, something calculating in his eyes. You should both tread carefully. With that, he strode from the room, his associates hurrying after him. The ride back to Nate's penthouse was filled with phone calls as he dealt with the fallout from the meeting. Tasha sat quietly, processing everything she'd witnessed. It was clear that Nate had won this round, but Thompson's parting words had sounded distinctly like a threat. "You were amazing in there," Nate said, when he finally ended his last call. Thompson didn't know what hit him. "I didn't do much," Tasha demurred, "just watched." "Sometimes watching is the most important thing you can do," Nate replied. "You noticed the folders. You held your ground with Thompson. Not everyone would have kept their composure like that." Tasha smiled, warmed by his praise. "So what happens now with Thompson with the board?" "Now we wait," Nate said. "The board will investigate the espionage claims. Thompson will either back off or escalate. Either way, we've bought some time." "We," Tasha repeated softly, noting his choice of words. Nate glanced at her. "Is that presumptuous of me, considering you a partner in this?" "No," she said after a moment. "It's nice, actually, to be considered a partner rather than an accessory." She hesitated, then added, "Marcus never saw me that way. As someone who could contribute, have valuable input." "Marcus is an idiot," Nate said bluntly, pulling into the underground parking of his building. Tasha laughed, the tension of the day finally breaking. "Yes, he is. But if he hadn't been, I might never have run away. Never met you." Nate turned off the engine and turned to face her. "Then I suppose I should be grateful for his idiocy." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility, until Nate's phone rang again. He glanced at it and sighed. "James, I need to take this." As they rode the elevator up to the penthouse, Nate on his call, Tasha thought about how different her life had become in less than a week. She'd gone from bride-to-be to runaway to, what exactly? Nate's girlfriend, partner. The uncertainty should have bothered her, but somehow it felt like freedom, the possibility to define herself, her relationships, on her own terms. When they entered the penthouse, Nate was still on his call, so Tasha went to the kitchen to make coffee. She was just pouring 2 cups when her own phone rang. Her mother. "Mom, how are you feeling?" she asked, answering quickly. "Better," her mother said, her voice stronger than it had been at the hospital. "They're releasing me this afternoon. Your father's here now." "That's great news," Tasha said, genuinely relieved. "I was planning to come visit you later today." There was a pause before her mother spoke again. "Tasha, there's something you should know. Marcus was here earlier. He's very upset. He was saying things about this Sinclair man you're with. Disturbing things." Tasha felt a chill. "What kind of things?" "He said Sinclair has a history of using women, that his last fiancée left town suddenly under mysterious circumstances, that he's ruthless in business." "Tasha, I'm worried about you." "Mom, you don't need to be," Tasha assured her. "Nate told me about his ex-fiancée. She was the one using him, not the other way around. And yes, he's tough in business, but that's not the same as being a bad person." Her mother sighed. "I hope..." "You're right, honey. I just don't want to see you hurt again. You've been through so much already." "I know, Mom, and I appreciate your concern. But I'm an adult, and I need to make my own decisions, my own mistakes, if that's what they turn out to be." After promising to visit later and saying goodbye, Tasha set her phone down, deep in thought. Marcus was escalating his campaign against Nate, spreading rumors to her family now. But why? Was it just wounded pride or something more? Nate emerged from his office, looking weary but satisfied. "Good news. The board is calling an emergency session without Thompson present. James thinks we've got the votes to formally reject the acquisition offer." "That's wonderful," Tasha said, handing him a coffee cup. "You deserve the win." "We deserve it," Nate corrected, taking a sip. "I couldn't have done it without you." He set his cup down and moved closer to her. "Tasha, I know this has all happened incredibly fast, and I know you're still dealing with the fallout from your wedding, but I need you to know that what I said in that boardroom wasn't just for show. You've become important to me." Tasha felt her heart racing. "Nate, The doorbell rang, interrupting her response. Nate frowned. "I'm not expecting anyone." He went to the security panel by the door and, checked the camera. His frown deepened. "It's your cousin, Layla, right?" Surprised, Tasha joined him at the panel. Sure enough, Layla was standing in the hallway looking anxious. "Let her in," Tasha said. "Something must be wrong." When the elevator delivered Layla to the penthouse, she rushed to Tasha and hugged her tightly. "Thank God you're okay. I've been trying to call you." "My phone was on silent," Tasha said, confused. "Layla, what's going on?" Layla pulled back, looking from Tasha to Nate and back again. "It's Marcus. He's lost it, Tasha. He came to your parents' house after visiting your mum at the hospital, ranting about how Sinclair had stolen you, how he was going to make things right. He had a gun, Tasha." Tasha felt the blood drain from her face. "A gun? Is everyone okay?" "Your dad talked him down, got him to leave, but he's been making calls, asking questions about both of you. I overheard him talking to someone about teaching Sinclair a lesson." Layla shook her head, clearly frightened. "I think he's actually planning to hurt you, or Mr. Sinclair, or both of you." Nate's expression had turned grim. "We need to call the police." "My dad already did," Layla said. "They took a report but said without direct threats there's not much they can do." "I know people in the department," Nate said, already reaching for his phone. "They'll take this seriously." While Nate made calls, Tasha tried to process this shocking development. Marcus with a gun, the man she'd almost married, threatening violence. It seemed unbelievable, yet Layla wouldn't make something like this up. "Have you seen him yourself?" Tasha asked her cousin. Layla nodded. "At your parents' house." "Tasha, he wasn't himself. His eyes were different, like he wasn't really seeing us. He kept saying that you belonged with him, that Sinclair had manipulated you, brainwashed you." "That's ridiculous," Tasha said, but a shiver ran through her. "I chose to leave. Nate just happened to be there when I ran." "I know that," Layla said. "But Marcus has convinced himself of this whole narrative where you were happy until Sinclair came along and stole you away." Nate rejoined them, his expression serious. "The police are sending a car to patrol the building, and they're looking for Marcus. In the meantime, I think we should all stay here where it's secure. Layla, you're welcome to stay too if you don't feel safe going home." Layla looked relieved. "Thank you. I was worried he might follow me here, but I had to warn you." Tasha hugged her cousin again. "Thank you for coming. I can't believe this is happening." "I can," Nate said grimly. "I've seen it before. Men like Marcus can't accept rejection, can't admit that a woman might choose to leave them. So they create a story where they're the victim, where someone else is to blame." "He never seemed violent before," Tasha said, still struggling to reconcile this new information with the man she'd known. "Controlling, yes. Dismissive of my opinions, definitely, but violent." "People can surprise you," Nate said, "not always in good ways." The rest of the afternoon passed in tense waiting. Tasha called her parents to check on them and to get more details about Marcus's visit. Her father confirmed Layla's account, adding that Marcus had seemed unhinged and had made specific threats against Nate. "Be careful, Tasha," her father warned. "I never saw him like this before. I'm not sure what he's capable of right now." By evening, there was still no word that the police had located Marcus. Nate ordered dinner delivered and set Layla up in one of the guest rooms. The three of them ate in the kitchen, trying to maintain normal conversation despite the circumstances. "So how exactly did you two meet?" Layla asked, clearly trying to lighten the mood. "Tasha hasn't told me the full story yet." Nate glanced at Tasha with a small smile. "She hijacked my car while wearing a wedding dress." "You make it sound so dramatic," Tasha protested. "I just got in and asked you to drive." "Begged me to drive, actually," Nate corrected, his eyes twinkling. Layla looked between them, a knowing smile forming. "Well, however it happened, I'm glad it did. I haven't seen Tasha this alive in years." "Layla," Tasha warned, feeling herself. "Plush, it's true," her cousin insisted. "With Marcus, you were always so careful, watching what you said, how you looked, always trying to please him. It was like watching someone slowly disappear." The observation hit close to home, and Tasha fell silent, remembering how suffocated she'd felt in that relationship. "I think I'm going to turn in," Layla said after dinner, sensing perhaps that Tasha and Nate needed time alone. It's been a long day. After showing Layla to the guest room, Tasha found Nate on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. She joined him, standing close enough that their arms brushed. "Someday, huh?" she said softly. "Not exactly how I planned it," Nate admitted. "Corporate espionage and death threats weren't on my agenda." Despite everything, Tasha smiled. "Mine either." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Nate spoke again. "I meant what I said earlier, Tasha, before Layla arrived. You've become important to me, more important than I expected." Tasha turned to face him. "You've become important to me too, and it scares me a little how quickly this is happening. A week ago, I was about to marry someone else." "Do you regret leaving?" Nate asked quietly. "No," Tasha said without hesitation. "It was the right decision, even with all the chaos that's followed. I need to be careful. Make sure I'm not jumping from one relationship to another without figuring out what I really want." Nate nodded slowly. "That's fair. Take all the time you need." He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. "I'm not going anywhere." The promise in his words warmed her, and Tasha leaned into his touch. "Neither am I, not tonight anyway." Nate laughed softly, then grew serious again. "We'll deal with Marcus and Thompson together." "Together," Tasha agreed, and when Nate pulled her into his arms, she went willingly, finding comfort and strength in his embrace. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from a car across the street. Binoculars trained on the balcony, a cold fury building as he observed their intimate moment. Marcus lowered the binoculars, his hands shaking with rage. "Enjoy it while it lasts," he muttered. "Both of you." In his pocket was the gun he'd shown at the Bennett house, now loaded. And in his mind was a plan, a way to make Tasha see reason to punish Sinclair for stealing what belonged to him, to restore the future that had been snatched away. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow everything would change. He started the car and drove away, already envisioning how it would play out, how Tasha would finally understand that she belonged with him, one way or another. Back in the penthouse, Tasha and Nate came inside, from the balcony, unaware of how close danger had come, or how much closer it would be tomorrow. "I should check on Layla," Tasha said, though she made no move to leave Nate's side. "In a minute," he said, drawing her closer. "I just want to make sure you know something." "What's that?" she asked softly. "Whatever happens next, with Marcus, with Thompson, with us, I don't regret any of it. From the moment you jumped into my car in that wedding dress, my life has been complicated, chaotic, and more interesting than it's been in years." His eyes held hers intently. "I wouldn't change a thing." Tasha felt something shift inside her, a certainty forming where doubt had been. "Neither would I," she whispered, and when Nate lowered his lips to hers, she knew that whatever dangers tomorrow might bring, tonight she was exactly where she was meant to be. Morning sunlight streamed through the blinds of Nate's penthouse as Tasha stirred awake on the living room sofa. She and Nate had stayed up late talking, planning what to do about Marcus, about Thompson, about their future. She'd fallen asleep with her head on his shoulder, more comfortable and safe than she'd felt in years. Nate was already up, she realized, hearing his voice from the kitchen. She stretched and followed the sound, finding him on the phone while making coffee. Layla sat at the counter, scrolling through her phone with a worried expression. "Any news?" Tasha asked, accepting the cup of coffee Nate handed her with a warm smile. "Nothing," Layla said. "I've been texting everyone who might know where Marcus is. No one's seen him since yesterday." Nate ended his call and turned to them. "That was the police. Still no sign of him, but they're keeping a patrol car in the area." He didn't look entirely reassured. "I need to go into the office today. Emergency board meeting about Thompson's attempted takeover." "Today?" Tasha asked, concerned. "Is that safe with Marcus still out there?" "SecureTech has excellent security," Nate assured her, "and this meeting could determine the future of my company. I can't miss it." "Then I'm coming with you," Tasha said firmly. Nate looked like he wanted to argue, but then nodded. "What about you, Layla? Will you be okay here?" "Actually, I should check on Aunt Margaret," Layla said, referring to Tasha's mother. "She was pretty shaken up by Marcus's visit yesterday." "I don't like us separating," Tasha admitted, "but Mom does need someone with her, especially if Dad has to work today. They made plans to meet later at Tasha's parents' house, where Nate's security team would set up additional protection. It wasn't ideal, but with Marcus still unaccounted for, staying together in one secure location seemed the best option. As Tasha dressed for the day in another outfit from the growing collection Nate had bought her, she thought about how quickly her life had transformed. A week ago, she'd been preparing to marry a man who, she now realized, had never truly known her. Now she was involved with someone who saw her clearly, valued her input, and made her feel like an equal partner. "Ready?" Nate asked when she emerged from the bedroom. "As I'll ever be," she replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The ride to SecureTech was tense, both of them scanning for any sign of Marcus. Nate's driver, a former security professional, assured them he was watching for threats. "The board's waiting," Nate said as they pulled into the underground parking garage. "We'll go straight up to the conference room." Security at SecureTech was noticeably heightened, with guards checking IDs carefully and escorting visitors. Nate had alerted his security team about the potential threat from Marcus, and they were taking no chances. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent, Nate clearly preparing mentally for the confrontation ahead. Tasha squeezed his hand and he returned the pressure, gratitude in his eyes. "Whatever happens in there," he said quietly, "remember that none of this is your fault. Not Thompson, not Marcus. None of it." "I know," Tasha replied, though a part of her couldn't help feeling responsible. If she hadn't run from her wedding, hadn't jumped into Nate's car that day, the elevator doors opened and they stepped into the reception area for the executive floor. Nate's assistant was waiting, looking anxious. "They're all here, Mr. Sinclair, including Mr. Thompson, who insisted on attending despite yesterday's revelations." "Of course he did," Nate muttered. "Thanks, Alice. Please make sure Ms. Bennett has full access to the building today." Alice nodded and quickly prepared a security badge for Tasha as Nate checked his messages one last time. "Shall we?" he asked, offering his arm to Tasha. She took it, drawing strength from his steady presence. "Let's do this." The conference room fell silent as they entered. The board members were all present, along with James, Nate's lawyer. Richard Thompson sat at the far end of the table, his expression coolly confident despite yesterday's setbacks. Nathaniel, Dr. Brandt greeted him. "We were just discussing the evidence of corporate espionage you presented yesterday." "And?" Nate asked, taking his seat at the head of the table, Tasha beside. "Him. It's compelling," Dr. Brandt admitted. "James has shared Jennifer Mills's full confession, along with the security footage. It's clear that confidential information was stolen and shared with Thompson Industries." Thompson leaned forward. "While I regret any impropriety that may have occurred, I maintain that my company had no direct knowledge of how our consultants obtained their information." "Convenient," Nate commented dryly. "Your consultants just happened to have access to our most confidential data." "The point," Monroe interjected, "is whether these allegations change the fundamental value proposition of the acquisition offer." "They absolutely do," Chen argued. "They demonstrate that Thompson Industries is willing to engage in unethical practices to achieve its goals. Is that really the company we want controlling SecureTech's future?" The debate continued, growing increasingly heated. Tasha watched carefully, noting the shifting alliances around the table. Dr. Brandt and Chen were firmly on Nate's side. Two others seemed to be leaning that way. Monroe remained staunchly with Thompson, while West appeared more hesitant now. "I think it's time we put this to a vote," Dr. Brandt finally said. "The question before the board is whether to formally reject Thompson Industries' acquisition offer and pursue legal action regarding the corporate espionage." "Before we vote," Thompson interrupted, his voice smooth but with an undercurrent of tension, "I'd like to offer a revised proposal, one that addresses the concerns raised yesterday." He slid folders across the table. "You'll find the new terms more than generous." Nate didn't even open his folder. "This isn't about the terms, Richard. It's about trust. You violated it. End of story." "Don't be hasty, Nathaniel," Monroe warned. "The new offer increases the purchase price by 30%. That's significant." "It's a bribe," Nate replied bluntly. And it doesn't change the fact that Thompson used illegal means to obtain confidential information. Alleged illegal means, Thompson corrected smoothly. Nothing has been proven in court. Yet, Nate countered. The tension in the room was palpable as Dr. Brandt called for the vote. One by one, the board members stated their positions. Chen voted with Nate. So did Dr. Brandt and another member. Monroe voted with Thompson. West, looking uncomfortable, also sided with Thompson. That left one vote. Harold Winters, who had been mostly silent during the discussion. All eyes turned to him. I've been on this board since Nathaniel founded SecureTech, Winters said slowly. I've watched him build this company from nothing into what it is today. He looked at Thompson coldly. And I've seen how you operate, Richard. How you acquire companies, strip them for parts, discard the people who built them. He turned back. To Nate. My vote is with Nathaniel. Reject the offer. Pursue legal action. Thompson's face hardened as he realized he'd lost. This is a mistake. One you'll all regret when SecureTech fails to meet its projections next quarter. We'll take that chance, Nate said, unable to hide his satisfaction. Now, if you'll excuse us, the board has other matters to discuss. Private matters. Thompson stood, gathering his things with deliberate slowness. This isn't over, Nathaniel. His gaze shifted to Tasha. For either of you. After Thompson and his team left, the atmosphere in the room lightened considerably. The board turned to discussing next steps, including a formal complaint to the Securities and Exchange Commission about Thompson's tactics. We should also prepare for retaliation, James advised. Thompson doesn't take defeat well. Let him try, Nate said confidently. We're in a stronger position now than ever. The board is unified. We have evidence of his illegal activities. And our new security protocol launch is on schedule for next month. As the meeting wrapped up, board members stopped to congratulate Nate and introduce themselves properly to Tasha. Dr. Brandt lingered longest. I've known Nathaniel for 8 years, she said to Tasha. I've never seen him bring anyone to a board meeting before. You must be very special. Tasha felt herself blush. We haven't known each other long, she admitted. Sometimes it doesn't. Take long to recognize what's important, Dr. Brandt replied with a knowing smile. I'm glad he's found someone who sees his worth beyond the business. Success! After everyone had left, Nate pulled Tasha into a triumphant embrace. We did it. Thompson's finished, at least as far as SecureTech is concerned. You did it, Tasha corrected, though she returned his embrace warmly. The board trusts you. They see what you've built here. Nate shook his head. Having you beside me made all the difference, your confidence, your support. He cupped her face gently. Thank you. They were about to kiss when Nate's phone rang. He checked it and frowned. It's the security desk downstairs, he answered, his expression growing more serious as he listened. When? Did you see which direction he went? Another pause. Keep. All entrances secured. I'm calling the police now. What is it? Tasha asked, a knot forming in her stomach as Nate ended the call. Marcus, Nate said grimly. He was just spotted outside the building, trying to get past security with a fake ID. When they challenged him, he ran. Tasha felt her blood run cold. He knows we're here. Yes, Nate agreed, already dialing the police. And he's escalating. After reporting the incident, Nate turned to Tasha. We need to get you somewhere safe. My apartment has the best security. But my parents, Tasha interrupted, suddenly remembering. Layla was going to my mom's house. If Marcus couldn't get to us here, understanding dawned in Nate's eyes. He might go there next. Call them now. Tasha's hands shook as she dialed Layla's number. It rang several times before going to voicemail. She tried her mother next with the same result. Her father's phone went straight to voicemail. No one's answering, she said, panic rising in her voice. We'll go there right now, Nate said decisively. I'll have security escort us to the car. The drive to the Bennett house was the longest 20 minutes of Tasha's life. She kept trying her family's phones, growing more frantic with each unanswered call. They could just be busy, Nate reasoned, though his tense expression betrayed his concern. Or the phones could be on silent. Or Marcus could be there, Tasha said, voicing her worst fear. When they pulled up to her parents' modest suburban home, everything looked normal from the outside. Her father's car was in the driveway, as was Layla's small sedan. No sign of Marcus's black SUV. Wait here, Nate instructed the driver. Be ready to leave quickly if necessary. They approached the front door cautiously. Tasha rang the bell, then knocked when there was no immediate answer. Just as she was about to try her key, the door opened to reveal her father, looking surprised. Tasha, we weren't expecting you until later. Dad, is everything okay? Is Mom all right? Layla? Confusion crossed his face. Of course, they're in the kitchen having tea. Why wouldn't they be okay? Relief flooded through her as Tasha pushed past him into the house, Nate following close behind. She found her mother and Layla exactly as her father had described, sitting at the kitchen table with cups of tea. Tasha, her mother exclaimed, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. Why weren't you answering your phones? Tasha demanded, still trying to calm her racing heart. Layla looked sheepish. Sorry, I put mine on silent when we got here. Didn't want to disturb Aunt Margaret. And mine's charging in the bedroom, her mother added. Is everything all right? Tasha exchanged a look with Nate before explaining about Marcus's appearance at SecureTech and their fears that he might come. Here, the police are looking for him, Nate added, but until they find him, we should all stay together somewhere secure. You think he'd actually hurt someone? Tasha's father asked, clearly struggling to reconcile this with the Marcus he thought. He knew. He had a gun when he came here yesterday, Tasha reminded him, and he just tried to get into Nate's office building using a fake ID. He's not thinking rationally. Her parents exchanged worried glances. Where would we go? Her mother asked. My apartment has excellent security, Nate offered. We'd all be safe there until the police find Marcus. Before anyone could respond, there was a loud crash from the front of the house. Tasha's father had left the front door ajar in their rush to check on the others, and now Marcus stood in the entryway, his eyes wild, a gun in his hand. Nobody move, he said, his voice eerily calm despite his disheveled appearance. Especially you, Sinclair. Nate instinctively stepped in front of Tasha, shielding her. Marcus, think about what you're doing. The police are already looking for you. Don't make this worse. Worse? Marcus laughed bitterly. How could it be worse? You stole my fiancée. You turned her against me. You took my future. I didn't steal anyone, Nate replied evenly, keeping his voice calm despite the gun pointed at him. Tasha made her own choice. She didn't have a choice, Marcus shouted, the gun shaking. In his hand. You manipulated her, brainwashed her. But I'm going to fix that, he gestured with the gun. Tasha, come here, we're leaving. I'm not going anywhere with you, Marcus, Tasha said, stepping out from behind Nate, despite his attempt to keep her shielded. This isn't the answer. Of course it is, Marcus insisted, a hint of desperation creeping into his voice. Once we're away from him, you'll see clearly again. You'll remember that you love me, that we're meant to be together. I don't love you, Tasha said firmly, ignoring her mother's gasp. I don't think I ever really did. I was just doing what everyone expected of me, being who everyone wanted me to be. That's him talking, Marcus accused, gesturing wildly with the gun toward Nate. He's poisoned your mind against me. No, Marcus, this is me, the real me, the one you never bothered to know. Tasha took a step forward, her voice growing stronger. You never asked what I wanted. You just assumed I'd go. Along with your plans, your timeline, your life. Because I knew what was best for us, Marcus shouted. I was building a future for us. For you, Tasha corrected. Not for us, not for me. Marcus's face contorted with fury. It's too late for this conversation. We're leaving. Now. He raised, the gun pointing it directly at Nate. And if he tries to stop us, I'll shoot him. Marcus, please, Tasha's mother pleaded. This isn't like you. Put the gun down before someone gets hurt. Stay out of this, Margaret, Marcus snapped, not taking his eyes off Nate. This is between me and him. No, it's not, Tasha said, taking another step forward. It's between you and me. Nate has nothing to do with why I left you at the altar. Liar! Marcus's hand shook more violently. You were fine until he came along. We were happy. Were we? Tasha challenged. When was the last time you asked me? What I wanted? What made me happy? You decided everything, where we'd live, when we'd have children, even what I'd wear to our wedding. Something flickered in Marcus's eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or a moment of clarity. but it quickly vanished, replaced by cold determination. "Enough talking. We're leaving." "Think about what you're doing," Nate said, still eerily calm. "You're holding 5 people at gunpoint. That's kidnapping, assault with a deadly weapon. You'll go to prison for years." "Shut up," Marcus shouted, his control clearly slipping. "This is your fault. All of it." The tension in the room was unbearable. Tasha could see her father inching slowly toward Marcus from the side, trying to get close enough to act. Layla was frozen in fear, while her mother had tears streaming down her face. "Put the gun down, Marcus," Tasha said softly. "Please, before you do something you can't take back." "It's already too late for that," Marcus replied, his voice flat. "There's no going back now." In that moment, several things happened at once. Tasha's father lunged for Marcus. Nate pushed Tasha behind him, and the sound of breaking glass filled the air as police officers smashed through the front windows, guns drawn. "Police! Drop your weapon!" an officer shouted. Startled, Marcus swung around, the gun still in his hand. Time seemed to slow as Tasha watched in horror, certain that the police would shoot. But before they could, Nate tackled Marcus from behind, driving him to the ground. The gun skittered across the floor as they struggled, and an officer quickly kicked it away while others pulled Nate off Marcus and handcuffed the subdued man. "Are you all right?" Nate asked, returning to Tasha's side as the police read Marcus his rights. She nodded, unable to speak as the reality of what had just happened sank in. Marcus, the man she'd almost married, was being led away in handcuffs, shouting accusations and threats. Her parents were huddled together, her mother sobbing in relief. Layla was talking to one of the officers, giving her statement. "How did the police know to come?" Tasha finally managed to ask. "I activated the emergency alert on my phone when we first saw Marcus," Nate explained. "It sends our location directly to the police. They must have been close by, still searching for him." "You saved us," Tasha whispered, leaning into him as the adrenaline began to fade, leaving her shaky and exhausted. "We saved each other," Nate corrected, wrapping his arms around her. "Just like we have since the day you jumped into my car." The next few hours were a blur of police statements, medical checks, and reassurances. Marcus was taken into custody, facing multiple charges. The officers assured them he wouldn't be released anytime soon, if at all. By evening, they had all relocated to Nate's penthouse as originally planned. Tasha's parents were in one guest room, Layla in another. Tasha sat with Nate on the balcony, watching the sunset over the city, a blanket wrapped around their shoulders against the evening chill. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "With Marcus? He'll face charges. With his family's connections, he might avoid the most serious ones, but he won't be a threat to you anymore." "I meant with us," Tasha clarified, turning to look at him directly. Nate's expression softened. "That's entirely up to you. I know it's been a whirlwind week. You might need time to process everything, to figure out what you want." "I already know what I want," Tasha said, with a certainty that surprised even her. "This past week has been chaotic and terrifying and nothing like what I planned, but it's also been the most alive I've felt in years." She reached for his hand. "I want to see where this goes, where we go, together." Nate's smile was like the sunrise after a long night. "I was hoping you'd say that. But," Tasha continued, "I do need some independence too. I need to find my own place, get back to work, rebuild my life on my terms." "Of course," Nate agreed immediately. "Take all the time and space you need. I'm not going anywhere." "And neither am I," Tasha promised. "Not anymore." As they sealed this promise with a kiss, Tasha marveled at the journey that had brought her here. 1 week ago, she'd been a bride preparing to walk down the aisle to the wrong man. Today, she was a woman who had found her voice, her courage, and possibly her heart's true home. Inside the penthouse, Tasha's mother watched them through the window, a small smile forming. "I think she's going to be okay," she said to her husband, who stood beside her. "Better than okay," he agreed. "I haven't seen her this happy in years, maybe ever." "It's not what we planned for her," her mother admitted, "but maybe her plan is better." "It usually is," he replied wisely, "when we let people choose their own paths." 2 months later, Tasha stood in her new apartment, surveying the simple but comfortable space with satisfaction. It wasn't large or luxurious like Nate's penthouse, but it was hers, a place she had chosen and decorated according to her own taste. Her job at the community college had welcomed her back, and she'd even enrolled in evening classes, pursuing the degree in education she'd always wanted but had put aside for Marcus's sake. The doorbell rang, and she opened it to find Nate standing there with a small gift bag. "Housewarming present," he explained, leaning in to kiss her. "You already gave me one," she protested, though she accepted the bag with a smile. "That was practical, kitchen stuff. This is just because I saw it and thought of you." Inside was a small, beautifully crafted silver pendant in the shape of a car, a whimsical reminder of their first meeting. "I love it," she said, laughing as she put it on immediately. "And I love that you get it, that you get me." "Speaking of getting you," Nate said, checking his watch, "we should go. Dinner reservations are at 8, and your parents are meeting us there." Her relationship with her parents had improved dramatically once they saw how happy she was with Nate. They'd even apologized for pushing her toward Marcus, for not seeing the signs that she was unhappy. As for Marcus, he'd accepted a plea deal and was serving time for assault and illegal possession of a firearm. The more serious charges had been reduced in exchange for his agreement to seek psychological treatment and stay away from Tasha permanently. Richard Thompson had also retreated after the SEC launched an investigation into his business practices. SecureTech was thriving, with their new security protocol receiving rave reviews in the industry. "Ready to go?" Nate asked, offering his arm. "With you?" "Always," Tasha replied, taking it. As they walked to his car, Tasha reflected on the strange, twisted path that had led her here. One impulsive decision, one moment of courage when she'd fled her wedding and jumped into a stranger's car, had changed everything. She'd been a runaway bride, fleeing a future that would have suffocated her. And in the process, she'd run straight into the arms of a man who saw her clearly, valued her strength and loved her for exactly who she was. Sometimes, Tasha thought as Nate opened the car door for her, the best journeys in life began with running away from what was wrong and toward what was right. Her heart had known the way all along. It had just taken courage to follow it. "What are you thinking about?" Nate asked as he slid into the driver's seat beside her. Tasha smiled, reaching for his hand. "Just that sometimes the best things in life happen when you least expect them, when you take a chance." "Like jumping into a stranger's car in a wedding dress?" Nate asked, his eyes twinkling. "Exactly like that," Tasha agreed, squeezing his hand. "Best escape I ever made." As they drove away together, Tasha knew there would be challenges ahead. Real relationships always had them, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the future or what it might bring. She had found her voice, her courage, and a love that didn't diminish her but made her stronger. Sometimes running away was really running toward exactly where you were meant to be all along. The end.